Juliet, I'll pass it to you to introduce the next panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you, Beju, and the panelists. As Simone said, that was excellent. Next, we continue on the data journey, and we're looking at web and social media scrapers and sentiment analysis. So during this session, we'll delve into the intricate world of web scraping, unraveling its theoretical underpinnings and practical applications. We'll explore the supervisory value embedded in the art of collecting and analyzing information from the vast expanse of the internet. So the panelists will illuminate the diverse types of data that can be harvested from online sources, providing a detailed exploration of the analysis that can be derived. They will discuss the indispensable role of sentiment analysis and other innovative methods in quantifying unstructured data, unveiling their pivotal value and utility in a supervisory context. So this will be an opportunity to gain profound insights into the power of web scraping and how it can revolutionize information gathering and decision-making processes. So I'll just introduce our moderator. In case you're just joining this session, I'll introduce Matt Grasser again. Matt is a co-head and principal technologist at Cambridge SupTech Lab. He'll be joined by our panelists. The first is Abhishek Rana. Abhishek is the senior data scientist at Cambridge SupTech Lab. We also have Christopher Guess, who's the lead technologist at We Know Technologies. And finally, we have Sanea Daruwala, who is the Chief Legal and People Officer at Zeit. So I'll hand over to Matt. Over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Juliet. Yeah, just to provide a bit more intro to the session, in many ways, like I see that 2023 could be fairly characterized as kind of a year of alternative data in the SupTech space. Things like extracting information from legacy unstructured data through PDF extraction, natural language processing, optical character recognition of images. So kind of going into the legacy data and extracting information from there, but also bringing in new sources of data. For instance, through our Launchpad Accelerator program, we're accelerating solutions related to complaints-powered early warning systems, social media trends, scraped web information, and insights derived from these as well. So what we've seen in 2023 is really a rapid evolution from more bespoke experiments over the past years in web scraping and social media analysis to this year really becoming part of the SupTech stack, at least in certain supervisory areas, to now increasingly being viewed as part of the digital supervisory infrastructure, which we touched on earlier this week, particularly for consumer protection and market conduct supervision. So we've actually seen authorities adopting and adapting these technologies to realize supervisory value. And many of these authorities we actually invited as panelists to this session, but were unable to attend at this particular hour of the day. But just to highlight a few before we dive in, since we don't have a supervisor on the panel today, we've seen Banca d'Italia's foundational work on social media sentiment and its use as indicators for a wide range of relevant supervisory metrics, things like stability of the banking system and other indicators for supervision. We saw in this year's BIS Irving Fisher committee report on data science and central banking, several case studies that use web scraping to inform a solution in the SupTech space. So Eileen Chong Yi and Dr. Ho Suijade at Bank Negara Malaysia have a case study in there. Dr. Bijan Sahami at Deutsche Bundesbank has a web scraping based solution. Jérôme Coffinet from Banque de France has a solution that's published in that report as well. So I encourage you, if you're looking for concrete SupTech applications in this space, to kind of go look at these resources. And later this week, there'll be sessions that include colleagues from SBS Peru, the Central Bank and SEC in the Philippines, OJK, the Financial Services Authority in Indonesia, and Bank of Ghana, who we'll hear from in a dedicated session later this week. But for those of us who may not be as deeply familiar with such technologies, today we've assembled this amazing group of expert panelists to demystify and provide some nuance to the conversation. So the panelists that are joining us today will share deep expertise in, of course, collecting and analyzing such alternative data, but also making sure we do so in a responsible manner that's compliant with laws and best practices. So I just want to welcome the panelists once again. Thank you for joining, and let's just jump right in. So maybe to kick off, we can do a quick round robin, couple minutes each. Sanaya, then Christopher, then Abhishek. How do you define web scraping, and what does it and doesn't it include in your perspective?
Hey everybody, I'm Sanaya. I'm the Chief Legal Officer for a web scraping company called Zeit. We do web scraping software and services, and we're one of the largest companies in the world in this space. And what I do in that is make sure we do it in the most ethical and legal manner. And essentially what web scraping is, I mean, the techies probably will describe this far better than the lawyer, but what web scraping is it's an automated way to pull data off of websites in its simplest form. And so when you use a piece of software like Zeit, you can use our API to pull data really off of any website. And where I come into that is because it's so powerful, because it is an automated way to pull whatever you want off the internet from wherever you want it. I put the guardrails around that. And so it's all about what you scrape, what fields of data you scrape. You know, you can be very specific about that. You don't just go to a website and pull everything that's there. You're very specific about the fields of data you want. If you're interested in consumer data, you can pull prices, you can pull product descriptions, you can pull reviews. So you want to get very specific about what you're scraping to make sure that that is compliant. And then also for your own purposes, because you don't want to scrape a bunch of data that isn't relevant to you. You want to scrape what you actually need to do your analysis. And so, yeah, you can just basically pull whatever you need off the web. And my role in that is to really put the guardrails around it. And our other two guys here would be more about how you go about doing that. And I'll talk more about the guardrails around that a little bit later.
Great. Thanks so much, Sanaya, for the initial framing. Chris, it'd be great to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so for me, scraping is a bit more of an existential thought, which is that you're trying to figure out what is happening in a certain place. In the real world, if you're a journalist, that means going and talking to people or reading books or newspapers or whatever is happening or available for a certain circumstance. And when it comes to the internet, the way that you do basically the same sort of investigation is you can look at what people have. And so if you are, say, a financial regulatory authority or something to that effect, and you want to know what's going on in the world with the organizations you are tasked to be observing, to be regulating, that is where that is what you want to know. And so scraping allows you to actually be informed about those sorts of pieces of information.
Cool. So we've got grabbing things from the web, seeking truth. Abhishek, anything you'd want to add to this? Oh, I think you're on mute. Sorry.
My apologies. Yeah, I think one thing that gets lost that should be really highlighted is that scraping should be targeted, right? From machine learning and pipeline perspective, it doesn't matter how powerful your model, how advanced it is, if you don't have the data to analyze, and you always should be thinking about, what is the outcome of the analysis, right? If it's decision making, what are the decisions that need to be made, and what's the analysis that has to happen? Now, if you don't have targeted data extraction, then it doesn't matter how advanced your model is. You're not going to be able to get the results that you're looking for. So I think targeted scraping is really, really important. And the other thing is really paying attention to the data that's being extracted, because the first step in any machine learning pipeline where bias comes in is during the data extraction process. If the data is biased, then your model is going to be biased, your decisions and outcomes and analysis is also going to be biased. So these are like some of the key points that you should consider when you're scraping data, is really focus on what do you actually need to make the decisions that you're going to make later on in the pipeline, and also the distribution of the data? Is your scraping procedure introducing bias into your model?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Abhishek. These are incredibly important points. And I think, they play into not just the bias component, which is incredibly important, but also the compliance, which we'll get into in a minute. That scope changes the scope of compliance and also changes the scope of deploying a production solution. If you're gathering all the data on all of the social media platforms, that's plenty more expensive than gathering, a targeted set of tweets about a certain topic or individual. So we'll be sure to dive into this in a moment, but thank you for adding that nuance to the conversation. So Christopher, turning to you for a minute, given your depth of experience in this field, first in journalistic fact-checking, now as a technical contributor to Winnow's open source intelligence-based SupTech solutions, can you speak to the value derived from web scraping as a practice in general, and also describe some of the distinctions or particular value that you see within the financial authorities that you and Winnow are working with?
Absolutely. So as I was saying before, it's really about seeing what is actually happening, right? A lot of people just see data points. I like to see it as a holistic viewpoint, because these are people. They're not putting up, spreadsheets usually. They are putting up their opinions, they're putting up their complaints, their comments, etc. And these are more useful for things such as financial compliance, because customers are often the first ones that will bring something up. This is similarly true when it comes to misinformation, another field that I've worked on extensively, in that the way that people react to certain events, the way that people react to certain occurrences within their own lives is very informative. Sometimes those are, if you're dealing with misinformation, those can indicate bad actors, right? People spreading things untrue, trying to lead a certain propaganda-based system. Sorry, guys. Methodology, trying to change the opinions of a certain population, or trying to just muddle the waters, which is often the case, more so often than even changing people's opinions. It's more about just making everything confusing when it comes to misinformation. And when it comes to financial regulators, you have to be aware of that too, because there could be such things as, there could be some corporate hijinks going on, people trying to bring down a competitor, people trying to make a certain organization look bad, or sometimes it looks bad, but it actually isn't. Say a regulated entity sponsors a football team and they lost last night, and all of a sudden there's 2,000 negative comments about that bank, but it's really just about the football team that they happen to sponsor, right? And so when the thing about scraping is that if you build up enough of a data set, it allows you to do the analysis. This is some other people on the panels more specific best practices, but this allows you to look at the overall aspects instead of just the specifics.
Yeah, that's great, Chris. I mean, I think that complements Abhishek's point earlier, talking about biases, right? It's not just through the limitation or the sample of the data that you're collecting, but even if you collect all of the relevant data, there's real world bias or considerations, noise that enters into the system that needs to be siphoned off and make sure we distill this down to the kind of like core insights that are actually there. We take a critical eye rather than just taking the results of analysis at face value. So this actually segues really nicely to my next question for Abhishek, which is, as a data scientist, you tend to work with the outputs of the type of data that, Chris and Winnow work with in kind of collecting and describing this, including with the lab's SupTech Pulse platform, which is an open intelligence collection tool for some SupTech trends. So I think to build on what Chris was just talking about from a technical perspective, what are some of the valuable analyses that can be done on this raw data, such as social media posts and website scrapes, that do help to kind of extract the signal from the noise and, leave the noise to the side?
I think we'll probably just focus on unstructured NLP data, right? So I know the topic is sentiment analysis. So there are a lot of very good models, language models out there that are very, very accurate, high degree of accuracy at, classifying posts, text into different sentiment categories. I think one thing that I would say beforehand is you should be very careful. A lot of the mistakes I've seen made are people want to analyze only the negative comments or the negative sentiments because that's how you address the complaints, right? But most of these models work in like 3 categories: positive, neutral, or negative. You should really also focus on neutral sentiments, because rarely does anyone post anything that's not opinion based. And things get classified as neutral because there's some positive things, there's some negative things, right? But you're going to lose a lot of information if you're just going to focus on what's being classified as negative, because in your neutral comments, there will be negative comments in there that you can, extract out sentence by sentence, let's say, and do your analysis. Now, once you have the text data, there is a plethora of different machine learning NLP tools you can do. For example, you can use topic modeling and try and aggregate the posts and find out, okay, what are the sort of products or services that all these negative posts are referring to. You can extract out entities, and in natural language processing, when we talk about entities, we're not just talking about organizations, corporations, we're also talking about locations. Maybe there's a certain branch where a service was provided where there's a lot of problems, for example. So you can really geographically scope things out, really extract out, aggregate stuff and extract out, centrally what are your products and services where you're receiving the most of complaints about, and even later on do some relationship extraction and find out, how are these things related, right? So mostly for Pulse, what we're trying to do is, after the web scraping phase, we're trying to find out, what are the SupTech solutions? Who is using them? Who is developing them? How are they similar to other SupTech solutions that are already in this space, and how are they different? And are they being adopted by a wide range of agencies? So all of these sort of correlations, and I'd like to think of them as semantic networks or knowledge graph sort of data, can be extracted and can really inform decision making, and also keep you up to date with the changes that are happening in this particular domain.
Great, thank you so much, Abhishek. And I think I want to build on a point that you made about neutral sentiment analysis being a valuable source of information. We shouldn't just throw it away because it's not negative. I think the same goes for topic modeling. Like with social media in particular, if you're trying to map to a set of financial products and services, and somebody's just yelling on the internet like this bank is terrible, that's really not going to map to a given product or service or a complaint category that's very well defined, in a very heuristic kind of manner. But there's still valuable information inside of that, right? Like there might be a thread below that says, hey, why do you think that is a terrible bank? And then there is some more detailed information under that, so it can be part of a conversation. So yeah, I think that it's an important distinction to talk about the noise within social media versus traditional collected compliance and supervisory data that's maybe brought in typically in a more structured format and in a more strongly validated format compared to what's out there in the wild on the internet. So Sanaya, turning to you, I mean, we're talked a lot about the kind of technical details and value so far. One thing we haven't really touched on in depth yet is the kind of like ethical practices and compliance practices of doing this work in the face of a lot of emerging and existing regulation and best practices in the world today. So to that end, you delivered recently like an absolutely engaging talk during the Web Extraction Data Summit. I watched it just last week and I said, okay, Sanaya definitely has to join for SupTech Week. And you provided in there like a step-by-step guide to compliant web scraping, not necessarily prescriptive, but like a framework that can be very useful. So building on that, I guess, what are some of the key compliance considerations you'd highlight for anyone, in particular financial authorities who are exploring building or buying a web scraping solution?
Thanks for that. So what I tried to do in that talk, and I'll try to do here for you today, is distill it down, because the tough part about web scraping laws is there is no web scraping law. There's no one overarching regulation that governs everything. It's not like the copyright directive where it's just here's where all the laws sit. There's a bunch of different laws that touch web scraping, and then a lot of it is defined by case law. And then there is significant active case law, particularly in the AI space right now and in the data protection space. So it's a bit of a minefield. So what I try to do, this is what I deal with day to day. So what I try to do is break it down into the categories that are kind of most relevant and most important. And then I'll try to highlight, for everyone here today, what might be most important to you. But the big things that you want to think about when web scraping are copyright laws, because you're scraping data that other people own. Any tangible original piece of work is copyrighted the instant it's made. An article, a book, a video, a picture, all of that is copyrighted, and you potentially could be scraping that data. Now, there's also plenty of data on the web that is not copyrightable, right? Facts are not copyrightable in most jurisdictions. I will give that caveat. There's like a couple random ones. But if you're in the US or the UK, facts not copyrightable. So things like prices of products, names of products, things of that nature. But also copyright law has this lovely exception for the most part, which is fair use. And so if you're taking in information, you're using it for internal analysis, you're not republishing it anywhere, you're not using it for a competitive purpose to the original work, you're likely falling into this fair use category. So I think for most people here today, you're probably okay on the copyright end, because you're really sitting in that fair use realm, or you're probably scraping factual data that may not be subject to copyright law. So while it is going to be very nuanced depending on your use case, likely you're sitting in an okay space for copyright. The next big consideration is data protection, personal data. And if you are doing sentiment analysis and you are scraping social media and that kind of stuff, personal data is everywhere. People's names, obviously, people's usernames on social media, that's personal data too. It might not be their actual name, but it still clearly links back to that person. And so it is very much considered personal data under the GDPR or in the US CCPA or the various state laws that are emerging monthly. And so you're going to need to look at that, and you're going to need to look at which laws apply to you, first of all, because there are various jurisdictions. In the EU, it's going to be GDPR. And even if you're not in the EU, if you're collecting data of persons in the EU, it's going to apply to you. And it would be kind of the most broad, far-reaching law. In the US, you've got a variety of state laws. CCPA in California is kind of the standard right now. And so you'll be looking at those two. And you really want to think about your compliance here. And very quickly, I can tell you in the US, if something is manifestly made public by the person, there's usually an exception under most of the state laws, and you might be able to scrape that data and process it and do what you want to do with it. In the EU, under GDPR, there's no such exception for public personal data. A lot of people think there is. They go, oh, it's public, I can do what I want with it. But it's absolutely not the case. GDPR makes no such exception. You have to have a lawful basis for processing the personal data. And lawful basis are things like consent, contractual agreement. When you're scraping the web, typically you're not going to have these things, and it would be a huge burden to get these things. So you're going to be relying on things like legitimate interest, or if you are a regulatory authority or a government entity, there are other lawful bases that apply, like there's public interest and some other things that could apply. So you're going to have to look at which lawful basis applies for you. If it's legitimate interest, you're going to have to do a legitimate interest analysis. You're going to want to get a data protection professional involved, especially if you're doing large scale scraping of personal data. You're going to have to comply with the security requirements. You're going to have to comply with the notification requirements, the subject access requirements. GDPR is a broad, far-reaching law, and there's a lot of work to do there. But the one easier thing I can tell you to do, and this is what I always advise people, is data minimization. It is one of the core principles under GDPR. If you do not need that piece of data, don't scrape it. And I think Abhishek mentioned this before. It's like, you can be very targeted about what you scrape. And if you don't need that person's name, don't scrape it. If you don't need their username, don't scrape it. Because if you're thinking about sentiment analysis, their actual personal data doesn't really matter to you. So if at all possible, anonymize it or don't scrape it. And then you just kind of sidestep all of the landmines. There still could be other things in there where if you are scraping like tweets or things of that nature, you know, they're going to @ people in those tweets. And so you still are going to get some personal data. And so you need to think about those things. But it is, the more you minimize, the better. So copyright, data protection, those are kind of two big things. And then lastly, really important, especially for like regulatory authorities and stuff like that, you want to keep it to public data only, unless you have a reason to go behind a login. If you are logging in to things like Twitter or X, I still have a hard time calling it X, or Facebook or Instagram or any social media like that, you're agreeing to their terms of service. And what the case law tells us, if you're explicitly agreeing to terms of service, you're more than likely entering into a binding contract. All of those terms of service, they don't scrape. And so you now have to follow that. So stick to public data, unless you have, look, some places might have deals with certain companies, or there might be exceptions under the particular arena you're in. That may be the case, but for the most part, stick to public data. And particularly if you are doing any type of investment decisions as a part of scraping, you definitely don't want to be getting any material non-public data, because that's like insider trading issues arise and things like that. So you just want to be really, really careful with that. So those are kind of the three big things. There's lots of other considerations, especially with the new AI laws coming out and the fact that social media companies have become more litigious in the web scraping space this past year. But those are kind of the highlights.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, and I think I want to call out, you mentioned GDPR a few times here. And for those in the audience and who will watch this recording later who aren't based in the EU, I think the important component of this is twofold. Number one, that many jurisdictions are using GDPR as a basis for data protection legislation or regulation. So there's copies of GDPR going all over the world. And secondly, GDPR doesn't only apply to agencies or data collection mechanisms that are based in the EU, that it's relevant to the data producers. I'm not going to try to speak legalese here, but if I'm a EU citizen and I'm tweeting something, I'm protected under GDPR, whether the scraper lives in the US or Singapore.
Correct. Yeah. No matter where you are in the world, GDPR applies if you are processing data of an EU person. So the data subject would be the technical term. If your data subject is in the EU, then no matter where you are in the world, GDPR applies.
Great. So thank you so much. I think this is like such an incredibly important framing and gives some practical, 3 dimensions to this for authorities to consider. Maybe we'll come back to this in a moment, but I do want to get Christopher's perspective. In practice, I imagine you're going into, well, I've seen as part of the Launchpad, you're working with financial authorities who are saying, what do you mean I can't have a username? Like, how am I supposed to interact with this individual at the end of the day? Hey, can't you just collect everything? And we look through it this way. So, given Winnow's experience working with a globally distributed client base of financial authorities with certain expectations, where do you think authorities can begin their journey to prepare for, integrating with a compliant solution like Winnow's, or, building their own solution, whatever they're going to do? How can they begin to prepare for this conversation, from an expectations or technical perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, Sanaya said some really very salient points in that you really shouldn't be collecting anything you absolutely don't need. And the way that you should be looking, or the way that we at Winnow, and really everyone should be looking at these sorts of scraping techniques and the use for them, is as analysis, not enforcement. That's the best way to really start dodging. Obviously, I defer to the attorney on the panel, but from my understanding, that is the best way to basically sidestep most of these concerns, is if you are using the data to analyze, not to enact enforcement. If you want to go that route, then that comes down to human collection, which as a regulator, you will have more of a legal cover for than we would to be collecting individual users' data and such things, right? That is where we are very careful, because as has also been said, sentiment, things such as topic modeling, these can be determined. There's absolutely no reason why you need to know the name of the user to determine the topic that is dominating the conversation at a given point. And I know that can be slightly disappointing to some of our customers, and it's an expectation that has to be managed. But they, if you ask them to think about it in their own personal lives, would they want their data, their spouse's data, their parents' data, their children's data to be collected, and these sorts of things, they will almost certainly say no themselves if you put it in a different frame set and a different mindset. And so when you're looking at other people's data, you have to think, what if it was mine? And that's something that we at Winnow are very careful about when it comes to these sorts of things. In my previous misinformation work, we do sometimes collect these sorts of pieces of information, specifically though, because we are trying to trace super spreaders of these sorts of things. And so it falls under a different legitimate interest. But that's a different topic and category and a different conversation and probably a different conference, to be honest.
Great, thanks, Chris. Quick clarifying question. You talk about the distinction between analysis and enforcement, or supervision and enforcement. Is the main distinction that you're talking about there like a platform giving insights versus giving the underlying raw data, or can you elaborate on that in just like 30 seconds or so?
So it is the insights versus the underlying raw data, but it's also the purpose of it. One is to point regulators into a specific direction that they may not have been aware of beforehand, right? That something may be going potentially wrong before it shows up in their own internal data, which may be collected, much later or much less granularly, or from sources that simply won't expose it. Banks don't tend to send regulatory data that exposes their own malfeasance, even if customers are complaining about it. And versus enforcement, which is where you look at the individual cases of this malfeasance or this, breach of law or regulation or what have you. And that's what the regulators, that's what their job is to dig into. We can point them towards a better, what sphere they should be looking at, or perhaps out of their hundreds of regulated entities, maybe these two are something that they should be really focusing their time on.
Great, yeah, that makes sense. So kind of focusing on the insights around a given supervised entity as opposed to the individuals who are talking about that supervised entity, because the goal is really to kind of understand the risks in the financial markets. So that makes total sense.
Yeah, and at that point, the regulator can log in and look at the posts themselves and pull that data individually, at which point, again, they have better legal coverage than we do in a more of a mass collection sort of system.
Great, thank you for that incredibly important nuance. And I think this applies, not only to Winnow, but any vendor of this type of solution that exists out there. So we've got about 5 minutes left. I've got one more question for Abhishek. I've been trying to incorporate some questions that I've heard also from the direct messages on the chat here. But Abhishek, yeah, I think if we're thinking bigger than the tech, right? If we're thinking about transformation that includes this, circling back to my point at the very top of the call, that includes this kind of year of alternative data. If we think beyond collection and analysis of social media specifically, what sorts of skills and tools should financial authorities be considering to prepare in order to analyze these data and produce outputs that effectively facilitate their supervisory end goals, like the ones Chris might be talking about a bit, or that we might have heard through our other engagements with the lab? What capacity building would be useful?
I think normally there are two approaches. The ideal approach is you have some outcomes in mind, right? And that can really drive the whole production process, including the targeting, right? So that's ubiquitous. So there are two ways to start on this. One is you have some data and you want to see what insights can you derive from that data, right? Or you start with, okay, these are the clear outcomes. These are sort of regulations or, malfeasance, non-compliance we want to target. Now, how do we work backwards then and store and gather and then process only the data we need to make these decisions and these outcomes. So, and that sort of targeted approach will save you not only legal compliance headaches, but also storage costs, right? Because you're not storing a lot of useless data that you just don't need. And then through the pipeline, I think there's so many open source machine learning AI tools out there that you can just implement, right? But are they black boxes? To a certain extent, because they need a lot of high level of mathematical competency to understand how they operate, right? So in the domain of financial regulation, you really need to be careful about your model selection, because at the end of the day, if you're making decisions, you want to be able to explain to the financial regulators, you want to have a process in place where you can say, okay, this person was denied this for whatever reason, right? So a lot of using, large language models, ChatGPT concerns me because one, they're already pre-trained on a lot of data. So sometimes the decisions and the outputs they provide are not based on the input. We see this all the time with NLP problems in research, like Q&A and stuff, like, because it's been trained on 1 million samples of some other data, and now you're trying to use it to make a decision on your particular domain, your particular problem case, and it's going to make its decision based on the other data that it's been trained on, and not make a decision on actually the input that's going in, whether it be a complaint or whatever. So in terms of skills, oversight is very important. A lot of these models, if you're looking for bias, if you just look at the core data, you tend not to see it. Once it goes into the black box and comes out, that's where you see the bias, right? And then you're like, okay, is the model bias? Very rarely, unless it's like some feature engineering step, whatever you've taken that's created some bias in there. But most of the cases, it's the data that you have is biased, right? So these are things that you have to keep in mind and not consider this a linear process. You're always at each step going to be testing, processing, whatever comes out, even if you're using a black box model, you'll see biases in there. They need to go back and figure out where that originated from. So, I know a lot of, like, for example, in the security sector, they don't have the luxury of having explainable models, because if a model is very good, it's not explainable. If you don't make decisions on it, the consequences are too high. But from a regulatory perspective, you really need your models to be explainable so that the decision-making process is there. You can eliminate biases from your whole pipeline, and it makes the implementation much cleaner.
And I think just it's a really amazing point, and it coincides a little bit with the laws we're seeing emerging on AI. The EU has their proposed AI Act, and anything that uses that has outputs that are decision-making outputs would be considered in this kind of higher risk category. They've given risk categories for AI and machine learning. And, so if you are training models with, whether it's web data or other data, you have to think about, if you are going to use that subsequently for decision-making, this is going to be considered high risk. And then what they're requiring of high risk systems is a lot more of a robust approach in comparison to what they consider lower risk. You're going to need a risk management system, data governance, record keeping, technical documentation, and they also want you to have human oversight in the loop because of the bias considerations and things like that. So that's kind of aligning very much with what the law is looking at least right now. It's still in draft, but that's coming down the pike.
Yeah, and I'd like to just have one more follow-up as well. When it comes to bias, a lot of people say unbiased, but what I think they mean is non-representative, because real-world data is often biased, right? One politician lies more than another, but if you need to have, unbiased would say that your data set would have equal amount of lies from both politicians, but that would not actually be representative of a real-world decision process. And so you need to be very careful when you're designing your data sets and your analysis to make sure that the data that you're working with doesn't conform to your own bias of what should be unbiased, actually, right? In a lot of situations, and a lot of people get in trouble with that, and it can get really sticky, and you end up reinforcing actually negative biases.
And one other thing I'd just like to quickly add is, a lot of the time the bias is inherent in the data because the bias exists in society, right? So that's still an open problem in machine learning, right? How do you, when you do your analysis, remove the bias that's there in society? It already exists. There's, I mean, there are ways you can try and do it, but that's like a real core problem that's requires a solution because, society and the rules that we have, the structure currently, there is bias inherent in it, and that's going to be reflected in the data and then the output of your models.
Thank you so much for these insights. I mean, not planned at all, but you guys are teeing us up incredibly well for the next session on algorithmic fairness. You're drawing from previous sessions where we talked about ethical frameworks. We had one of the lead authors of the EU AI Act earlier today. So thank you so much for tying themes together, not only from your individual areas of expertise, but from across this entire day and across this entire week of really interesting conversations on this front. Sanaya, Abhishek, Christopher, thank you so much for joining us here today. And I will turn it back over to our MCs to guide us into the next session. Thank you so much.